Today is early January 6, 2023. This is my update for Russian military operations in and around Ukraine. So let's get started. I usually go to the map. There really are no major updates on the map. The front line is more or less stable. There's still heavy fighting around Bakhmut, and everywhere else the situation seems to be more or less stable. There is fighting taking place, but the lines are not changing. I want to talk about this Ukrainian strike on assembled Russian forces. On the Russian side, they say it has gone from 60 something to now 89 dead. Ukraine immediately said there was like 400, 600 dead. How could they possibly have known that soon? Russia is still counting their dead. So the Russian numbers seem to be much more realistic and reasonable. The Ukrainian numbers were obviously fabricated. There's no way they knew that quickly how many were dead. Now, I want to talk about this because this was December 31st. We're over a week now past this incident, and yet the Western media is still talking about it. So let's look at this Politico article. Very recent. Ukraine grinds down Russian morale with deadliest strike in the war. That is not true. It's only true if Ukrainian claims of 400, 600, however many dead are actually true. It is not true. There's no way that it's true. There's no way for them to have known that quickly. The Russian numbers are much more reasonable, and when you consider many times more Ukrainians die every single day from Russian strikes and in the fighting, then this is nowhere near the deadliest event or incident or in any way significant for Ukraine. It's being covered for over a week now because it happens so infrequently. Let's read what Politico says. It says, Ukraine is seizing upon its deadliest strike against Russian soldiers so far in the war. Okay, so that might be true. It might be the deadliest strike Ukraine has carried out. It is by no means the deadliest strike in the war. Maybe for Ukraine it is, but that's not saying a lot, to be honest. So it's Ukraine's deadliest strike against Russian soldiers so far in the war to warn the enemy that they are not safe in bases behind the front lines, while Russians are turning on their own commanders over the scale of the rocket attack against a building in Makivka in eastern Ukraine. So everything for the West and for Ukraine is about optics, even when obsessing over those optics reveal how actually weak you are. So you're in the middle of a war. Why would you be warning Russia by carrying out a strike like this, rather than carrying out strikes like this at every possible opportunity you had? Because this is how you actually win the war, by destroying more of their forces than you lose of your forces. This is exactly what Russia has been doing on a nearly daily basis. They carry out precision strikes like this on a nearly daily basis. The Ministry of Defense in Russia reports on this every day, and there are videos and photographs and maps that come out almost daily on Telegram documenting all of these attacks that Russia carries out. Ukraine carries out these attacks very rarely. Do they have success like this? This is why we've been hearing about it for now a week. I've mentioned this before. Ukraine has HIMARS. They have a very small and decreasing number of the actual launchers and a decreasing number of the guided rockets, but they have allowed Ukraine to carry out these type of attacks. And before that, they had their own multiple launch rocket systems. They had their Tochka-U missiles. They were able to carry out attacks like this. Their ability to do this has diminished from late February to today. And Russia, on the other hand, has a huge number of precision strike long-range weapons. They have their cruise missiles and military aviation. They have long-range drones like the Garan 2. They have loitering munitions like the Lancet and Kub. They also have their own version of the HIMARS, the Tornado S, satellite-guided rockets. The Tornado S has more rockets per launcher and can fire them further than HIMARS. They also have the Iskander missile complex. This is like the ATACMS, but it could actually fire missiles even further, and they are just as precise as the ATACMS, and they have a large number of them. They have been using them throughout this entire conflict from late February onward. If Ukraine is able to carry out strikes like this, and they are being reported on by Politico and everyone else across the Western media, just imagine what Russia is doing with the exact same capability, but just on a much larger scale. That is very important context, and the fact that they're still talking about this a week after it happened tells you how rare it is and how this is being seized upon politically precisely because it means nothing strategically or even tactically. Now, if you are skeptical about how poorly Ukraine is actually faring in this conflict, or how the Western media is actually increasingly admitting to this, why don't we look at this article from Foreign Policy? Ukraine needs long-range firepower for victory. Kiev's allies should give it the ability to shift strategic gears. And, well, they need all of these things for victory, because right now it's very obvious they will not achieve victory the way things are going. And this is what the article even says. It says, ending the war in Ukraine and saving lives requires decisively defeating Russia. Okay, but exceedingly, but that's not going to happen. But exceedingly difficult decisions lie ahead. Moscow's campaign of destruction against Ukraine's energy system weaponizes winter against Ukrainian civilians, seeks to exhaust Ukraine's air defenses, that is already happening, and sets the stage for a significantly more severe European and global energy crisis in the winter of 2023 and also 2024. Russian President Vladimir Putin's likely goals are to make Ukraine uninhabitable and destabilize European politics through a refugee crisis, break the political will of Ukraine's military benefactors, and force a ceasefire that allows Russia to retain stolen territory. As a backstop, Russia aims to destroy Ukraine's infrastructure so thoroughly as to render it an economically failed state ripe for reinvasion after a temporary peace. Well, it already is economically destroyed completely, and that will never change. Not into the foreseeable future, unless Russia does take over all of Ukraine and then rebuilds it. The West is not going to rebuild it. They can't even rebuild themselves. All of that sounds extremely bleak, and this is all an understatement of how bad things are for Ukraine. And then the article starts talking about, well, if we don't want this to be like this, this is what we need to do. So this is what the solution is. Deterring a future war means Ukraine will first need to recapture a nearly Hungary-sized portion of its territory that remains under Russian control. This will likely require main battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, lots of artillery, and the ability to interdict Russian troops and supplies 30 miles, and ideally much further, behind the front lines. Essentially, Ukraine will need an entire new army. That's what they're saying. That's what that means, what they're saying. So this article, the author says, I focus on the last item, long-range precision strike capacity, because Ukraine cannot win without it, and only the United States can both provide it at scale and inspire other alliance partners to join in. However, absolutely none of these things, including long-range precision weapons, exist in the quantities needed for Ukraine to do any of this with. There's no practical way to transfer these weapons to Ukraine, and we've already talked about shortages of artillery shells and long-range precision weapons. This article talks about these ground-launched small-diameter bombs that would be attached to rockets and used with HIMARS and also the M270s that the West has sent Ukraine in very small numbers. And I've already talked about how the West admits these ground-launched small-diameter bombs, they have huge numbers of these bombs that they could put onto these rockets, but that's going to take a lot of time. And it'll be a year or two, they'll be making very small numbers of these, and it'll be years before they could ramp up production. So this is actually not a solution. And this author mentions none of this in their article, and this is all fantastical thinking. This is all thinking being done by people who don't understand how industry works and have not even read Western industry's own admissions that this is impossible. The article also talks about Ukraine developing its own cruise missiles, But what it's actually admitting is that NATO is essentially building these cruise missiles for Ukraine and just making it look as if Ukraine built them themselves. This is what the article says. Kiev now pursues a 1,000-kilometer range indigenous drone system, which could target airfields in Belarus and deep into Russia, as well as munition plants, naval bases, fuel storage, military depots, staging areas, and railways. Deep strikes at an intensity of dozens or more per month would be a proportional response against Russia's now months-long campaign against Kiev's industrial base and energy system. They would also erode Russia's offensive warfare capacity without directly targeting Russian civilians or political leadership, thus advancing military aims while managing escalation potential. Well, we've seen them attempt this 3 times. All 3 times they have completely failed to achieve these objectives. These drones were shot down. The debris caused very minimum damage. It caused some deaths at these airfields. But even if you did this dozens of times every single month, this is not going to impede the Russian war effort at all. Not at all. They keep forgetting that Russia has the best air defense systems in the world. They also have the largest country in the world. It is not Ukraine. It is not the situation Ukraine is in, and there's no way for Ukraine to put Russia in the same situation that it currently is in right now. Then the article says Kiev is already laying the technological groundwork for this shift, but it likely will not be able to scale it up to a strategically impactful level without NATO support. So they're admitting that this has no strategic value. It is purely political, and it would need NATO support to succeed. And I'm going to go out and say, on a limb, and say that even with NATO support, it will not make any sort of strategic impact. It says, a Ukrainian deep drone strike campaign should be a Ukrainian enterprise from build to bang. But this would not preclude NATO countries from providing component parts, especially since they have already collectively provided Ukraine with systems responsible for killing thousands of Russian soldiers to date. Yet Moscow has not crossed the nuclear threshold or otherwise sought direct military conflict with the alliance. Key inputs would include guidance systems, motors, and multi-effect warheads. So that's probably what we're seeing. We're seeing what is essentially NATO components put together by NATO technicians inside these Soviet-era drones to make it look like Ukraine built them themselves. And then they've fired 3 of these at least into Russia, and they've made absolutely no difference. And now they're talking about ramping up the production of these systems. But just like with everything else that NATO is doing, even things that they already know how to make, they are in short supply. It'll take a very long time to ramp up production to the numbers they will need to cause the same type of damage that Russia is inflicting on Ukraine right now. And this shows how absolutely desperate the US and NATO have become. They're just continuously escalating. And I'm warning, and I have warned about NATO, the US particularly, wanting to create some sort of, at the very minimum, create some sort of buffer zone in Western Ukraine. And I don't think that it's out of the question that the US will try to pressure a nation like Poland or the Baltic states to create a coalition of the willing, as Colonel Douglas McGregor has called it, where they'll actually go into Ukraine and pick up where the decimated Ukrainian forces have just pretty much just dropped dead and died. They will just fill up into these positions and continue the proxy war for the United States. Poland and the Baltics will just become the next proxies being used by the US to perpetuate this proxy war. So this article is admitting how bleak things are for Ukraine. It's laying out all of these fantastical solutions that have no possibility in reality of actually helping. But what it is doing is advocating for escalation. That is what it's doing. And so since we're talking about escalation, let's talk about this. From France 24, Macron promises first Western tanks for Ukraine. And you see a picture of it right there. That technically it is a light tank. I mean, you see that it has wheels. So it is when you think of tank, when most people think of tanks, when the West talks about tanks, they're talking about main battle tanks. This is a light tank. It does mostly reconnaissance, but also could help with fire support. It is not the same as a main battle tank. It has light armor. It can stop up to a 23 millimeter round, but anything else will completely destroy it. So pretty much everything that Russia is using can destroy it, except small arms fire. The article says France is set to become the first Western country to deliver tanks to Ukraine. The French presidency announced Wednesday after talks between Emmanuel Macron and Ukrainian counterpart Vladimir Zelensky. The move to supply the French-made AMX-10 RC to Ukraine, a light tank model in service since the 1980s that is being phased out in the French military. So it's junk that they're trying to get rid of, essentially, represents a significant shift in French military support for Ukraine. It also says it was not immediately clear how many of the French tanks would be dispatched or when they would be delivered, though training and maintenance has been agreed as part of the deal. The AMX-10 RC tanks are light and six-wheeled rather than on tracks. They were designed for reconnaissance missions and have been deployed in France's most recent overseas military operations in the Sahel region of West Africa and in Afghanistan, where in both cases they have failed. They are very mobile, perhaps old, but high performance, a French official said. So they're light armored. They're for mostly reconnaissance. They can do fire support if you have absolutely nothing else. If you are out of tanks like Ukraine is, it's better than nothing. But again, very light armor. Pretty much everything that Russia has, that it has in great abundance: artillery, tank fire, anti-tank missiles, RPGs. The guns on Russian infantry fighting vehicles would completely destroy these French light tanks. And so what difference is it going to make? I want to show you this. This is from the French Ministry of Defense, and it's talking about as of July 2021, AMX-10 RCR tanks, they have 247. They plan on replacing these in the French military, but the replacements will not be ready until 2030. So how many of these will France actually be able to send Ukraine? It's hard to tell. And then, again, there is training. It is like a tank minus the tracks, minus the heavy armor, minus the heavy gun, but otherwise it is a tank, a light tank. It's still going to require months of training for the crews to be proficient. Of course, you could abbreviate that training. You can get a driver driving it in a week or two. You could get every position for the crew in the tank, that you can get them operating in a week or two, but they will not be proficient. They will go out on the battlefield, they will not know what they're doing, and they will end up dead. Just like everyone else driving everything else that the West has sent Ukraine, and everything else Ukraine started this special military operation out with it to begin with. They had hundreds of tanks, hundreds of armored personnel carriers, hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles. They're all gone. That is why France needs to send them these. Now, just like the Patriot missile system, the US is sending Ukraine, which may not even get there anytime this year, 2023. It may arrive 2024. I've talked about all of the issues that it has. There's an ongoing missile shortage that is not going to be solved anytime soon. So it is a symbolic gesture, and even in the Western media, they say, well, it's a very nice symbolic gesture of support for Ukraine. And maybe that's what this is. So France can say, look, we've helped you out a lot. We've sent you self-propelled artillery. We even sent you tanks, even though it's not really a tank. Well, it's a light tank. But they can say that. We even sent you tanks. But the other possibility is that this is, again, tiptoeing toward further escalation. They're going to send these light tanks, and then they're going to tell Germany, and I'm going to get into that here in just a moment. The France 24 article says transfers of fighter jets, long-range missiles, and tanks have long been viewed as potentially provocative, risking a more direct confrontation between Russia and the West. And well, France doing this is one small step in that direction toward that escalation. So that brings us to this article from the Washington Post. U.S. edges closer to sending armored weaponry to Ukraine. President Biden acknowledges that Bradley fighting vehicles are under consideration for delivery to Kiev as France pledges light tanks. And there the Bradley fighting vehicles are. And just to give you an idea, the Bradley fighting vehicle is even more useless than this AMX-10 RC. It's even more useless and will be even more inappropriate for Ukrainian forces, but it's all the U.S. has left. And so that's what they're thinking of sending Ukraine. And this is what the Washington Post says. After months of resisting Kiev's pleas for tanks to face increasingly dug-in Russian forces along the lengthy southern and eastern fronts, the United States and its allies are now poised to deliver a variety of armored fighting vehicles to Ukraine. And the problem is the West has been sending Ukraine dribs and drabs of all kinds of equipment, including heavy weapons. Poland and other Eastern European nations have sent hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles to Ukraine. This is mostly what they used in their Kharkov and Kherson offensive. They're all gone now because, as I've explained many times, they simply rushed into Russian defense lines and Russia destroyed them. And yes, they caused Russia to withdraw from Kharkov. They had mostly withdrawn anyway. But as they were leaving, and because they have this advantage in long-range weaponry, and because Ukraine forces were now out from behind their defenses, they were able to destroy them out in the open. They did the exact same thing in Kherson. So we're talking brigades worth of equipment and men gone. Now they're talking about sending this equipment. Not only is Russia going to be able to recreate the same effect, destroying any Ukrainian offensive that comes forward. I've already talked about how Russia is building these extensive defensive fortifications, ditches to trap tanks, dragon's teeth to slow them down, and to channel them into kill zones that Russia has prepared well ahead of time. They're creating these extensive defenses that they did not have before that will make it even more difficult for Ukraine to channel even less equipment and well-trained men into these offensives. So this is what the future looks like for Ukraine. The Washington Post continues, asked Wednesday if U.S.-produced Bradley fighting vehicles were under consideration for transfer to Ukraine, President Biden replied in the affirmative. A senior administration official said the Bradleys could be included in a package of weapons to be announced as soon as this week. Well, again, you could announce it this week. You can send them to Ukraine unless U.S. forces are operating them. It'll be weeks or months before Ukraine actually starts using them. Germany has repeatedly turned down Ukrainian requests for its Marder infantry fighting vehicles and Leopard 2 main battle tanks, largely on grounds that it didn't want to be the first to provide such weaponry. Well, now France has crossed that red line they themselves drew, so now Germany can follow. Now, there's problems with Western armored vehicles, and the Washington Post explains. The administration continues to rule out sending even larger Abrams battle tanks, which weigh 55 tons and rely on a turbine engine that guzzles fuel at a drastic rate, said the first official, one of several who spoke on the condition of anonymity about the sensitive issue. They are also prone to breakdowns and require extensive maintenance expertise. They all do. All of these systems that the West is sending Ukraine, except Soviet-era systems from Eastern Europe, which they are now out of, require a lot of technical expertise, and they all have to be sent to the Polish border, into Poland, to facilities on the border to be repaired. So you're talking taking it off the front line, bringing 1,000 kilometers to the Polish border, to these repair facilities, getting it repaired and bringing it 1,000 kilometers back to the front line. That's what Ukraine has to do every time something breaks down. Russia does not have that problem. Basic logistics. Regarding the Bradley, the Washington Post says, the Bradley, while technically not a tank, would offer a significant upgrade for Ukraine ground forces. Well, considering they're out of everything, then it's, like I said, it's better than nothing. Weighing about 28 tons, which is more than Soviet-era infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers weigh. It travels on tank-like tracks and carries a 3-person crew with room for up to 6 additional soldiers inside. The United States has thousands of the vehicles, and sending an unspecified number to Ukraine would not undercut U.S. inventories. But again, the Bradley is even less impressive than the AMX-10 RC. Again, it's heavier than the Soviet-era equipment that Ukraine has been using and that Russia has in abundance. It makes it a bigger, heavier, and more vulnerable target on the battlefield. It will require more fuel. It requires specific maintenance that Ukraine will not be able to carry out. It'll have to be brought to Poland to be fixed. It requires ammunition that Ukraine does not normally use, so that will have to be shipped in. And the same goes for the AMX-10 RC, by the way. It uses proprietary ammunition, which will have to be sent by France to Ukraine to keep it operating, to keep it firing on the battlefield. And then the article closes by mentioning how Poland will be receiving hundreds of U.S. armored vehicles because it has sent hundreds of its own Soviet-era systems to Ukraine. Hundreds of systems that went to Ukraine, tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles that no longer exist in large numbers because they were lost during the Kharkov and Kherson offensive, which is why the US and France and Germany are talking about sending tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles, and also light tanks like the AMX-10 RC. I've also talked about how even the best main battle tanks in the West, in battle, have not fared well. We've seen M1 Abrams in Yemen used by Saudi Arabia being destroyed by rebels with very limited means. We've seen Leopard 2 tanks used by Turkey and northern Syria. They have suffered a lot of setbacks. They've been neutralized on the battlefield. These are not wonder weapons. They do not provide Ukraine with any sort of capability they didn't have at the beginning of the special military operation. They're simply providing them with additional armored vehicles because they are out of the vehicles they started this fight with. And because of all the logistical problems, maintenance problems, technical problems that these vehicles have, the fact that Ukraine is not familiar with them, do not normally operate them, they're actually at a disadvantage using these versus what they started the special military operation out with in late February with. So again, it's another troubling sign that the West is in the middle of this proxy conflict that it itself started, and it cannot see any off-ramps. All it can think to do when it reaches an impasse is to simply escalate. So that is what they're doing. They're escalating. We remember German and then French politicians in turn admitting that everything in regards to bringing peace to Ukraine, the Minsk agreements, these were all lies and treachery on behalf of the West. Tricking Russia, attempting to trick Russia, buying time for their proxies in Ukraine to rebuild their strength, to continue to pose a threat to Russian-speaking Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, and also pose a threat to Russia right there on its border. So any assurance that the US or Europe make now with Russia regarding this proxy conflict, what are those assurances worth? I would say they are worth absolutely nothing. Now, I'd like to point out a very good update on the situation in Syria by the RAN. They were talking about how Turkish and Syrian defense officials met together in Moscow. They're talking about diffusing the situation. This is an over a decade plus proxy war the US was waging, attempting to overthrow the government of Syria. Russia intervened in 2015. And they kind of blocked this regime change war, proxy war. And now Russia is diplomatically bringing it to an end, bringing Turkey and Syria together, possibly having Turkey withdraw, and Turkey and Syria and maybe Russia working on Turkey's security concerns, because the US is not only using the Kurds as a proxy against Syria, but also against Turkey and also Iran. Now, one point Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mikouris made during this update regarding Syria was look at the situation in Ukraine, and when you're wondering how it might end, look at the situation in Syria. The US constantly escalated amid its proxy war in Syria. Every time they met an impasse, all they could think of was, let's escalate. And Russia very skillfully parried these escalations, managed them, blocked different efforts by the US to get involved more directly. Sometimes Russia would have to suffer temporary humiliation or frustration. But in the long term, and this is how Russia thinks, they think very long term. In the long term, they succeeded. Their revenge is ultimately winning this conflict and sending the US home, out of Syria, possibly out of most of the Middle East. And that is what they're thinking in Ukraine as well. So there's a lot of parallels. There's a lot of parallels between the US proxy war against Syria and also Russia, and it's now it's proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. There's a lot of parallels. The US will continue escalating. It does not have a reverse gear. There is no off-ramp. They will continue escalating, and it'll be up to Russia to manage this escalation and continue frustrating US efforts in Ukraine until everything crumbles and the US has no choice but to leave, like what it looks like they're going to have to do in Syria, like what they had to do in Afghanistan. Hopefully, and hopefully soon, this will be the case in Ukraine. But again, what's at stake here? For Russia, it's existential. They have to win in Ukraine. This is existential. If they lose in Ukraine, the US will just continue encroaching on Russia and then eventually divide, destroy, and overthrow the government in Russia. And then they'll move on to China. And so this is not just Russia's concern, this is also China's concern. What is at stake for the US and for NATO? Their primacy over the planet. And not self-preservation in terms of the US as a country or the EU as a political bloc or each individual member state, but just their primacy over the rest of the world, which is unwarranted. What will they do to preserve that primacy? We don't know. They left Afghanistan. They're losing in Syria. They refuse to escalate in both cases. They are losing in Ukraine. Will they escalate? I can tell you that if they fail in Ukraine, the prospects of them reasserting themselves over China in Asia do not exist. The prospect does not exist. That is over. And they will just have to accept a multipolar world and their role within it rather than them reimposing themselves over it. How far will they go to prevent that from happening? I don't know. Only time will tell, and we'll have to keep an eye on it. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos on YouTube are uploaded to Odyssey and Rumble. The subtitles for my YouTube videos are auto-generated. They'll show up in a day or two. In the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it or to block it. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been supporting my work, thank you so much. That is what makes this work possible. And as always, thank you for watching.